Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's YouTube video where I'm going to cover exactly why you have to add value to your property within the first 6 to 12 months of ownership. It's a cornerstone principle of my investment philosophy that if you're going to acquire property and a commercial property, which is a rather illiquid market, you really need to be doing so in a way that's really pragmatic, that's purposeful, that's not flippant. And in order to get that right, what I have found over 20 years investing in the commercial property market is that the best and the safest way of securing an asset to market movement and market fluctuations, which are beyond your control, is to manipulate an upward shift in the asset value within the first 6 months of ownership. And you can do that with your own hands and your own nous. And so it's one of my cornerstone philosophies that I teach in my online course. But really importantly, I want to show you why this is such an important thing and why I wholeheartedly believe it, particularly in an environment where we're seeing a lot more buyers advocacy, a lot more buyers agents enter the market, which imbues an additional cost on property purchase that may not have been there 2 or 3 years ago. So in this particular scenario, I'm actually going to walk through it live here for you. And I'm going to just use a property of an estimated value of 4 million, right? $4 million. Now, if we have a look at this property at $4 million, I've got a screenshot here showing that the stamp duty on that's around about $198,000. So let's call it 200 grand just to be safe, because sometimes the spreadsheets it can be a little bit off these calculations by, a couple of $100. Now, on a $4 million property, you also are going to need a valuation. So you could estimate anywhere between, it would also depend on the number of leases that you might have on a property. But let's say you had an industrial premises that was fully leased to one tenant or vacant. You might be looking at a $5,000 valuation fee. And then you've got to add on your legal costs and your contract reviews. Now, in order to actually transact the property, you're going to need a solicitor to assist you with the contract. Now that's usually $1,500 to $2,000. So I'm going to go with the conservative approach and put in 2,000. But on top of that, what you often need to factor in is if there's a lease review, or if there's searches that need to be done, or if there's anything slightly untoward or not perfectly vanilla in your purchase that you want to take into account or need some advice on. So maybe there's a lease that is governed by the Retail Tenancies Act, or maybe there's an easement over the block that you want to understand, or maybe there's a road widening that's coming, or maybe there's a whole host of things that could essentially increase this price. And what I usually like to do is add in another kind of $1,000 to $2,000 for legal costs in this regard. Then obviously you need to settle the asset, and that can be quite cheap. You could probably get someone to attend settlement for you for about $1,200. And then you've got a technical due diligence report, okay? Now, tech due diligence report is an absolute fundamental of my buying mandate. I always get one, unless it's a strata property that's got a really healthy CapEx budget that I can understand. And the reason they're so important is because when you're buying a property, you're not just inheriting the land, but you're inheriting the buildings on the land. And you want to understand the four walls, the improvements, the roof, the aircon, the ceiling, the wall coverings, the floor coverings, what fixtures and fittings come with the building. You want to really understand that, because there can be significant costs to that, particularly aircons, particularly lifts. I've bought countless premises and had to spend $200,000 within a couple of months on brand new air conditioners or a brand new lift. But at least I went in with my eyes wide open, knowing that from the outset. And I was able to do that because of the information that's contained in the tech due diligence report. So it's an enormously valuable report that I always I mandate to use in my acquisitions. And there's usually about $7,500 for that. Now that could be even up to 10 grand, 11 grand, depending on how far you want to go. You could also get some assistance with the compliance of your property, which is really important to understand, like your fire compliance, your water, electricity, your green credentials, things like door openings, things like universal accessibility, things like on-ramps, ambulant toilets. All of these things will play into the leasability of a property. And you can get those things added on to your technical due diligence report. They're usually about $1,000 for each add-on. You might want a compliance review. You might want a depreciation report. So what I'm saying is a minimum cost share of about $7,500, but that could go up to about 10 or 11 grand. Again, if you're buying a $4 million property, you cannot be sitting here worried about a $2,000 cost to save you potentially hundreds of thousands, or to identify a risk and save you hundreds of thousands of dollars of lost money, okay? Then I always like to get an AC report. These used to be free, but in today's market, usually a good aircon contractor will charge you a nominal, maybe $250 to get on the roof and take a look at all the aircons. Now that doesn't need he's going to actually fix them for that, but he'll just get on the roof, he'll spend an hour or two of his time taking photos of what's there, giving you an update on the air conditioning age, what type of aircon it is, the coolant that it still uses, the refrigerant it still uses, is the gas still being supplied, are they out of stock, is it in a healthy condition, how long you can expect it to keep working, are there any filters broken, all of that. You'll get that all for a $250, even worst case scenario, $500 report. Okay, and I absolutely think that that is such a paramount consideration when you're buying a property. The other thing I like to do is an area survey, and I cover this in my online course, but I cannot tell you the amount of times I've bought a property and the agent has said, look, yep, here's a 2,000 square meter industrial premises, there's 2,000 square meters for lease, and I'll go get a survey and there's actually 2,100 square meters, or there's 2,050 square meters. Or there's 2,000 square meters of showroom and there's 100 square meters of mezzanine. Or, all of those examples there are where there's actually more value to the premises than what you thought you were buying. Or the inverse could be true in that they're saying there's 2,000 square meters and you go look at it and it's only actually 1,500 square meters of usable, usable warehouse, and maybe, 250 square meters of cold storage and 250 square meters of mezzanine. And you might say, well, hold on, that's not what I thought I was buying. So it is really important to get an area survey unless you've got extremely up-to-date areas and in a surveyed capacity with square meterages, and they've measured to the middle of the wall or the outside of the wall. You really want to understand that when you're buying a property. So that's usually about $1,500 to get that area survey done. Now, I mentioned it earlier, but in this current world that we live in, there is a growing trend here of buyer's agents. So I'm going to put a buyer's agency fee in here. It's something that I've only used once or twice in the past, and really I've done it just to honor a good friendship of mine. When sometimes properties find their way to me through my networks, I'll say, thank you so much, mate. Like, I appreciate you, sending that one to me. I haven't really gone out and engaged a buyer's agent before, and I don't recommend that, but for the average punter, that might be a really great way of getting some help getting your first commercial property. But what that does is it adds to your cost base. Okay, so if they're charging a 1.5% fee or a 1% fee, if we're looking at this, we could be spending about $60,000 in terms of actual just cost to go buy the property. Okay, again, that's adding to your cost base. Then you might need a demographic report depending on the usage and your intended future usage of the property. So if you're buying a property that's got a 10-year lease to, McDonald's, it might be pretty vanilla. You might not need a demographic report. But if you're buying a property that's currently being used for industrial purposes and you want to convert that usage to retail, then you might want a demographic report on the average household spend in the region, how big is the catchment area, how many how many children are in each household in the area, what is the locality of the catchment, what's the primary, the secondary, the tertiary catchment area, how many times people are visiting the property. All these things will impact any retailer wanting to take occupancy of that space. So it's something I've actually done on countless occasions when buying retail property in particular, or when I've looked at a property and gone, I don't know if that property's current form or current usage is actually the best practice or the highest potential usage. I think there is a different usage of XYZ, and I want to test the assumptions of that usage. So maybe I want to convert it from office to student accommodation, or maybe I want to convert it from industrial to retail, or maybe I want to convert it from large format retail to pure strip retail, or any of those changes, I'll use a demographics specialist to give me a really good understanding on the kind of end point that I'm hoping to achieve and what you would need to see from a demographic catchment in that area for people to actually interact with your property or your proposed property in the right way. This is really important also when you're getting to things like medical. You might look at, okay, I'm hoping to secure a doctor or a chiropractor or a dentist for this premises. Well, a demographics report will tell you how many doctors are in the catchment area. Is that an oversupply or an undersupply based on, your state or based on the national average? Maybe the national average is 30 doctors per, 15 square kilometers, and maybe there's 35, in which case there's an oversupply of doctors. All these things are really important for you to understand when you're buying a property, because remember, when you're acquiring a property, you've got your due diligence there to fulfill your investigations, but your investigations are there to give you comfort. You need to get comfort on what you're identifying and what you are uncovering. So I often suggest a demographic report is a really good way to go. I do it on all my properties. That might be anywhere from $5,000 to $7,500, but let's just be safe. I'll just put in $5,000 as a rough guide. And then we might put another $2,000 in here for costs. And that could be anything from, I want the outgoings statement to be audited, or I want a particular contractor to give me a update on the lift, or I need to get a neighbor's report to understand the energy efficiency of the property. There are a number of things that could easily account for, a grand or two on a $4 million purchase, right? Now, I've gone through all of those costs to show you that there's $286,000 worth of cost to buy a $4 million property. And that's at a conservative base case scenario. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that when you're buying a property for $4 million, you're essentially costing you $4.286. Now, what is that extra $286,000 as a function of your purchase price? Well, let's have a look. It's an extra 7%. That is astronomical, okay? So again, I want to show you that a lot of it is in the stamp duty. So there's over 5% of it sitting in the stamp duty. There's maybe 1.5% of it sitting in the agency fee. What happens if that was just 1%? Okay, all of a sudden, you've got an additional 6.67% of costs just to buy the asset, okay? Now, what I want to make sure is that I'm adding value to a property within the first 6 months to recover those costs, such that if there is a blip, or if there is a cause for concern, or if there is a softening of the market that I am buying into, not the property, the market that I'm buying into, that my asset value is protected and my capital is protected. Because what's my downside in getting into an illiquid market, right? The downside is that it could take a long time to move a property, to actually sell a property in an illiquid market. Now, as we've talked before in some of my other YouTube videos, there's actually some positives to an illiquid market because the value doesn't change overnight necessarily. There could be some real kind of barriers to that immediate change that you might see in the stock market, for instance. There's no short selling, for instance. There's no automated stop losses, for instance, as you see in the stock market. But that illiquidity also means that in order to sell the asset, there's usually some transaction costs of doing that, and it might take you some time. So what I'm looking at is my absolute downside. What happens if I buy a property and in the first 6 months, it doesn't go according to plan, the market moves against me, and I need to get out? I want to save the capital that I put in, okay? So let's look at some assumptions here now on selling an asset, okay? So you might have sales costs. There's obviously the commission to the agent. Now that might be anywhere from, on a $4 million property, that might be 2% maybe. Let's have a look. Let's just say you sell it for exactly what you bought it for, okay? All of a sudden, that's $80,000. I'm just going to format these cells. There's commission, there's marketing, how are you actually going to sell the property? You're going to put it online. There might be marketing, there might be some photography, and there might be some drone flyover. You need to get imagery of the property. There might be some listing and advertising costs, so here there might be $5,000 for marketing. Maybe you're going to put some advertisements into the local paper. There might be, anything from $5,000 to $10,000 here, but let's just call it $5,000. You might have another $2,000 for good photography. You might need an information memorandum to be prepared. They might need to do some touch-ups to the property potentially, but I'm going to leave that out for now. Let's just say we've got, a couple of $100 for IM preparation. And all of a sudden, we have a look at that. We've got another $92,000 of costs to sell the property. Okay, so now what am I saying? I'm saying that in total costs in and out, we're here with 266,700 plus 92,500. We're at 359 grand on a $4 million property. Have a look at that. We are at, let's make it a percentage. We're at almost 9%. So what I'm showing you guys is that if you're not adding value to a property within the first 6 months and you need to sell it, like you need to transact that property to get out of it, you are already underwater by 8.98, or in this case, almost 9% just on the costs to get in and get out. That's assuming you haven't made $1 from actually any rental that's come in the door. That's assuming that you haven't paid any interest to the bank. What about the finance costs, establishment fees to get your finance set up? Are you using a bank or a non-bank? Is that 0.5%? Maybe it's 1.5% in an establishment fee. So when we're looking at properties, again, like I'm always advising my clients, I'm saying, guys, look, I've got this online course here that shows you how to be really prudent on the way in. Because remember, in order to buy a property on the market, what are you essentially? Just think about that for a second. If you're going to buy a property on the market and there are other bidders bidding on that same property, you need to be the one person that's willing to pay the most out of every other buyer, unless your terms are astronomically better, right? Typically speaking, you need to be the person willing to pay the most. So that's the decision you're making when you come to buy a property. You're literally putting your statement and you're saying, look, out of Australia, potentially even worldwide, I'm the one person willing to pay the most for this property. Now, why would you do that if you're then just going to sit back and wait for the market to improve? My mandate is far different than that. I look at that and I go, if I'm willing to pay the most, I'm willing to pay more than that guy, and more than that person, and more than her, and more than them, and more than that corporation, and I'm willing to pay more than the next door neighbor, blah, 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 then I want to make sure that I can add value to that asset within the first 6 months. Now, let's have a look at what else might happen if you don't add value in the first 6 months, okay? Let's come up here and we're going to do something very easy. We're going to go value, we're going to go cap rate, and we're going to go rental, okay? Now, let's presume that our value here stays at 4 million, okay? Now, I'm just going to go equals 4 million, okay? Now, what I like to do is I like to apply a cap rate when I'm buying of around about 7% to 7.5%. That's the range that I like to buy property, right? And then I usually like to try and sell property at a range of around about 6%, 6 to 6.5. So I always want there to be at least 75 basis points difference between my buying cap rate and my selling cap rate to account for some of these costs and to account for movements in the market that are beyond my control. Again, what I'm trying to show here is an ethos of controlling the things you can control immediately from the outset. Now, in every property I've bought for my clients or my syndicated investors, I've added value in the first 6 to 12 months without doubt, every single one. Now, 12 months is even a little bit long. I like to add it within the first 6, sometimes in the first couple of weeks if you can get it right, okay? And I'm showing you why. So let's say we buy a property at a 7.5% cap rate. Well, what does that mean? It means the rental is around about $300,000 a year in rental, okay? Great. What happens next year? So let's say this is year 0. What happens next year, right? Well, naturally, we're going to have an escalation in the rent if that lease has got some tenure on it. Now, if you're buying a vacant property, well, obviously this is the market rent. And leasing that property in the first 6 months is usually going to add the value you want to add. In this particular scenario, I'm going to show you something even more conservative and say, okay, if we're buying a property now that is already leased, let's say there's 2 or 3 years on the clock, and they're paying $300,000 a year and you're buying it at a 7.5% cap rate, that produces a valuation of $4 million. What happens to the rent next year? It might increase, right? There might be an escalation. Now, what would that escalation be? Let's say that escalation is 3%, which is pretty standard in leases today. It just about keeps up with inflation, okay? So now we're going to go 1 plus 3, boom. And all of a sudden, we can see that next year, we're going to have $309,000 in rental. Now, if we apply the same cap rate, what is that going to produce in a price? You ready? Let's do it that way. I'm going to go that divided by that. Boom. $4.12 million. Okay. Now I want to show you the difference. So between that 4.12 and that $4 million is 120,000. Okay. So what I want to show you now is what are the costs that we have shown to buy this asset. Let's just make these cells all pretty together. We'll do that, do that. We'll come here and we'll just try and these a little bit easier to see. Okay. So what I'm suggesting now is that we have got a year one, so that's when I'm buying the property, a $4 million property at a 7.5% cap rate produces a rental income of $300,000 a year. Let's say that rent escalates in 1 year's time, which is, usually escalations are an annual thing. Let's say it escalates by 3%, which is a pretty conservative assumption. Sometimes it's CPI, which might be 3.6 right now. Sometimes it's a little bit less, 2.8, right? But let's just assume it's 3. That means your rent's going to go from $300,000 to $309,000. Now, at the same cap rate, what have you just done? Well, you've added $120,000 to the property value. But have you added that to the value, or is the market added that to the value by staying the same, by the way? If the market stays the same, which means the cap rate stays the same, your escalation in rent has produced an increase in the price of the asset, okay? Because someone buying this asset is now going to get $309,000 in perpetuity rather than $300,000 in perpetuity, and they'll pay slightly more for that. So we say, okay, well, we've made 120 grand, but have a look at our costs here. We still spent $359,000 buying the thing and in order to sell the thing. Because if you actually want to get that 120 grand, you're going to have to sell it or revalue it, okay? Now, if you're selling it, look, what is the difference? Let's go here and we'll say the equals, actually I'll do it this way. Yeah, boom, yeah. That's the total. And what I'm showing you here is that a lot of people will buy commercial assets and say, oh, I like to buy stable assets with 10-year leases in place and sit back and do nothing. And what I'm showing you is that if you do that, if the market improves for you, that's fantastic. But if the market doesn't improve, what's actually happening is that they're sitting there in an asset and their money's gone backwards. Their capital value has gone backwards in the first year by $239,000. Let's have a look what happens in year 2. So let's take the same cap rate. Again, we're going to use the same escalation. We're going to do that. Boom. So now it's taking $309,000 at a 3% escalation gives you $318. We're going to do the same. Oh, wow, there's $4.243 million in value now. Now the difference in value here, we're going to go, actually before we do that, we're going to make it this one. Great. All of a sudden, bang, we've made $243,000 in value by doing nothing again. And our costs were the same. And all of a sudden, how much are we underwater? Oh, we're only $115,000 underwater. Can you see how that's the passive approach? Now, if you're going to own an asset for 20 years, well, then that means nothing to you because your time view, your time horizon is long enough that you can absorb that slight deterioration in your capital value over the first year or two. But what I think is, well, wouldn't you rather add value during your first 6 months if you can? And there's so many ways of doing that. And I show you all of these in my online course, but let's just say you're able to reduce the cap rate by 50 bips. Boom, now you're in the green. If you can reduce that cap rate by 50 bips, so from 7.5 down to 7, you're in the green. Now remember, you could have received a rental income for these years too, and you might have had to pay bank interest, but let's just take the capital into account, not the cash flow, just the capital. You would then be above water. How interesting is that, okay? And what happens if you were able to increase the rent by 10% instead of 3%? All of a sudden, you're $172,000 better off in a capital outcome again. Now there's some small nuances here because the commission of 80 grand is based on a $4 million exit, whereas over here it's a $4.5 million exit. So you might have to swell your commission slightly because there's going to be a slightly higher sale price if you're presuming this set of circumstances here. But what I'm suggesting is, isn't that a more astute way of buying property to then add value in the first 6 months? And all you need to do is compress that cap rate by 25 bips. It gets you there. If you can compress the cap rate by 25 bips and you can increase the rent by, pretty close, we're only 14 grand out. If you can increase the rent by 6% and reduce the cap rate by 25 bips, you've made your transaction costs back in year 1, which means that if this property is now needing to be sold in an illiquid market, which is exactly what commercial property market is, you are going to be okay. You haven't lost your capital. Now, you might have had a return during the time, as in a rental coming in and an interest going out, but you also would have incurred finance costs. You would have incurred an establishment fee. You might have incurred some bank charges, establishment costs to your facility, blah, blah, blah. But what I'm suggesting here is that in a capital account, you won't be underwater. This is why I always advise my clients, if you're gonna buy a property, don't just sit there and buy it passively. Otherwise, you're basically just assuming the market is gonna hold exactly the same or get better. And if it gets better, well, that's good timing, well done. But if you're gonna sit there and buy a passive commercial property and just hope the market's gonna stay where it is, what happens if interest rates increase by 300 bips like they did after COVID? Or what happens if, GFC comes lurking? Or what happens if a bank goes under in America and all of a sudden everyone takes their money out of the financial markets? Or God forbid, there's a financier in Australia that goes under. What happens if the stock market plummets a few bips and all of a sudden, investor capital is not as free as it was before to come into commercial property? All these things could impact your property purchase without your control, right? Because they're impacting the market. And what I'm suggesting is taking some responsibility and some onus on day 1 of buying an asset, such that I won't even buy it unless I can add value in the first 6 months. Now, if you like this, guys, I just wanted to show you this as raw as it gets. I've had a lot of commentary asking for raw videos and to see my actual sums. And this is what I do, guys. I do this on a daily basis. I always want to add value in the first 6 months of a property purchase for this exact reason. I go through exactly how to do that in my online course, which you can find at investorcode.com.au. And if you like this content, please subscribe and follow, and I'll keep bringing you content like this in next week. Thanks so much for watching.